There is a weapon so powerful that it can make people apologize for things they never did. It can make confident people question themselves. It can make intelligent people obsess over conversations that happened days ago. And the frightening part is this: the weapon makes no sound, no shouting, no threats, no insults, just silence. A message left on read, a conversation that suddenly ends, a cold room where someone who once spoke to you freely now behaves as if you don't exist. And somehow, that silence speaks louder than words ever could. Perhaps you've experienced it yourself. An argument ends, hours pass, then days. No explanation, no closure, only silence. Suddenly, you find yourself replaying every conversation in your head. What did I say? What did I do wrong? Why are they acting this way? The silence becomes louder than the conflict itself. Welcome to Coded Soul, where psychology meets power. There is a reason this works. Human beings are not built to handle uncertainty well. The mind prefers bad answers over no answers, because a bad answer can be challenged. Silence cannot. Silence leaves room for imagination, and imagination has a habit of becoming cruel. A child once lost in a supermarket does not panic immediately. At first, they simply look around, but as the seconds stretch into minutes, the mind begins creating possibilities. Maybe they left me. Maybe I won't find them. Maybe I'm alone. The absence of information becomes more frightening than information itself. Manipulators understand this better than most people realize, because sometimes the most powerful way to control a person is not by speaking. It is by creating a vacuum that the other person desperately tries to fill. And the person who controls the silence often controls the conversation. Most people think manipulation happens through lies. Sometimes it does, but experienced manipulators often prefer something much cheaper: silence. Because silence forces your mind to do the work for them. Imagine sending a message to someone who normally replies within minutes. An hour passes, then 3, then 12, then a day. Nothing. At first you assume they are busy. Then your mind begins searching for explanations. Are they angry? Did I say something wrong? Are they ignoring me? Should I send another message? Should I apologize? Notice what just happened. Nobody accused you. Nobody attacked you. Nobody demanded anything from you. Yet your emotions have already started moving. You are negotiating with a person who has not said a single word. This is why silence can become a weapon. The human brain dislikes unfinished stories. Psychologists sometimes call this the need for closure. When something feels incomplete, the mind keeps returning to it, again, and again, and again. A song that stops before the final note stays in your head. A movie that ends without an explanation bothers people for days. An unanswered question demands attention. Manipulators understand this instinctively. They leave conversations unfinished. They disappear after conflict. They withdraw affection without explanation, not because they need distance, but because uncertainty creates emotional movement, and emotional movement creates leverage. The person who feels confused often becomes the person who starts chasing answers. Once that happens, the balance of power begins to shift. You send another message, then another. You explain yourself even though nobody asked. You apologize before understanding the problem. You begin defending yourself against accusations that were never made. The manipulator remains silent. You do the work. This is why silence often feels heavier than words. Words give you something to respond to. Silence gives you something to fear. And fear has always had a vivid imagination. A manipulator does not always need to attack your confidence. Sometimes they simply wait for your own mind to do it for them, because the most effective prisons are often built from uncertainty. This is Coded Soul, decoding the patterns hidden in plain sight. The difference between distance and control. Not all silence is manipulation. Sometimes people need space. Sometimes they need time to think. time to calm down, time to process emotions they don't yet understand themselves. That is not manipulation. That is emotional regulation. The difference is intention. Healthy silence creates clarity. Manipulative silence creates confusion. Healthy silence sounds like this. I need some time to think. We'll talk tomorrow. Simple, clear, respectful. You may not like it, but at least you know where you stand. Manipulative silence sounds different. It says nothing. And that is exactly the point. Because the goal is not distance. The goal is uncertainty. The manipulator wants you asking questions they have no intention of answering. What did I do wrong? Why are they acting like this? How do I fix this? Notice how quickly the conversation stops being about their behavior and starts becoming about your reaction. That shift matters. Because once you become focused on restoring peace, you become easier to control. A man forgets an anniversary. His partner stops speaking to him for 3 days. No explanation, no conversation, no expression of hurt, only silence. By the second day, he is buying gifts, apologizing, promising change, trying desperately to end the discomfort. Maybe he was wrong, maybe he wasn't, but that is no longer the issue. The silence has already achieved its purpose. Control has replaced communication. Carl Jung believed that what remains unconscious often controls us from the shadows. Silence works in a similar way. The less information you have, the more your unconscious mind begins creating stories to fill the empty spaces. And those stories are really kind. You assume anger. You assume rejection. You assume abandonment. Because uncertainty rarely produces optimistic conclusions. Manipulators understand something most people do not. The human mind will often punish itself more effectively than another person ever could. They simply provide the silence. Your imagination provides the suffering. And perhaps that is why this weapon is so effective. Because unlike shouting, unlike insults, unlike threats, the wounds created by silence often feel self-inflicted. You become both the prisoner and the prison guard. Why empathetic people are often the easiest targets. You might think manipulators target weak people. They don't. More often than not, they target caring people, patient people, empathetic people, people who naturally assume the best in others. Because empathy has a weakness. It makes you search for explanations on behalf of people who refuse to give you one. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe they're going through something. Maybe I should be more understanding. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I misunderstood. Notice the pattern. The manipulator remains silent. You become their lawyer, defending them in a courtroom they never entered. This is why emotionally intelligent people sometimes become trapped in manipulative relationships longer than anyone expects. Because they understand emotions, but they also overestimate the emotional honesty of others. They assume everyone communicates in good faith. Manipulators know this, and they use it. A friend suddenly becomes distant. No explanation. You immediately begin searching your memory. Was it that joke I made? Did I forget something important? Should I call them? Should I apologize? Meanwhile, the other person says nothing. You do all the emotional labor. You carry all the uncertainty. You carry all the responsibility for restoring the connection. The silence quietly transfers the burden from them to you. And once that pattern begins, it really stays small. Soon you find yourself apologizing first, reaching out first, fixing problems you didn't create, carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you, until one day, you no longer recognize the relationship, because somewhere along the way, you became responsible for both people's emotions. Respect is rarely lost in one moment. It disappears in patterns. And one of the fastest ways to lose your position in any relationship is to become the person who is always chasing peace while the other person controls distance. Manipulators do not create insecurity. They look for it. They do not create self-doubt. They look for places where it already exists. Then they apply pressure, like water finding cracks in a wall. The crack was already there. They simply knew where to push, which leads to an uncomfortable truth. The people most vulnerable to manipulative silence are often the people who care the most, the people who love deeply, the people who hate conflict, the people who would rather blame themselves than risk losing someone else. And that is exactly why manipulators choose them, because kindness without boundaries is often mistaken for permission. There is a moment when silence changes its purpose. It stops being about reflection and starts becoming about control. You can usually feel the difference. Real distance creates space. Manipulative distance creates anxiety. One leaves you feeling respected. The other leaves you feeling punished. A disagreement happens. You try to talk about it. The other person disappears. Hours become days. Days become longer. Every attempt to communicate is ignored. Not rejected. Not discussed. Ignored. And slowly, something strange begins to happen. The original issue disappears. The conversation is no longer about what happened. Now, the conversation is about getting them to speak again. That is the shift. That is the moment control enters the room. Because the person who controls access often controls the emotional climate. You begin lowering your standards. You become more agreeable, more careful, more anxious. Not because you changed your mind, but because your nervous system wants relief. Human beings are wired to avoid social rejection. Thousands of years ago, exclusion from the group could mean death. Part of your brain still treats rejection as danger. Manipulators do not need to know neuroscience to use this. They simply discover what works. They notice that silence creates movement. It creates chasing, apologies, concessions, negotiation. The room becomes quiet, and suddenly, the other person holds all the cards. A child learns this early. They sulk until they get attention. An adult manipulator simply becomes more sophisticated. The methods become quieter. The principle stays the same. Withdraw connection. Wait for discomfort. Allow the other person to move first. What makes this dangerous is that it often looks like strength. The silent person appears calm, in control, unbothered. Meanwhile, the other person feels emotional for wanting communication. But wanting communication is not weakness. Wanting clarity is not weakness. Wanting respect is not weakness. The weakness begins when your fear of losing someone becomes greater than your respect for yourself. Because at that point, you stop asking whether their behavior is acceptable and start asking what you can do to make it stop. That question changes everything. Because the moment you become willing to sacrifice your standards for peace, the negotiation is already over, and you have already lost more than the argument. You have lost leverage. You have lost boundaries, and piece by piece, you begin losing yourself. How to know when silence is being used against you? The difficult thing about manipulative silence is that it rarely announces itself. There is no warning label, no confession, no moment where the other person says, "I am doing this to control you." You have to recognize the pattern, because manipulation is rarely found in single moments. It lives in repetition. Once is a bad day. Twice is unfortunate. But eventually, a pattern begins to emerge. You bring up a concern. They disappear. You express a boundary. They become distant. You disagree with them. Suddenly, the room becomes cold. The calls stop. The messages slow down. The connection is withdrawn. Not permanently. Just long enough for you to feel it. Just long enough for your mind to start negotiating. Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe I should apologize. Maybe I should just let this go. And then, almost magically, the silence ends. They return. The warmth returns. The attention returns. The affection returns. But only after you move toward them. Only after you bent first. Only after you taught them that silence works on you. That is how patterns are born. Not in one dramatic moment, but in quiet repetitions. Reward, withdrawal, reward, withdrawal. Eventually, your behavior changes without you noticing. You speak more carefully. You hide your opinions. You avoid difficult conversations. You stop asking questions you have every right to ask, not because you agree, but because you remember the cost of disagreement. That is not peace. That is conditioning. And conditioning is powerful. A dog does not need to understand the science behind training to respond to it. Neither do human beings. We move toward reward. We move away from discomfort. Manipulators understand this instinctively. The silent treatment becomes a lesson, a warning, an invisible fence. Stay inside the boundaries, and connection returns. Step outside them, and the silence comes back. One of the clearest signs that silence is being used as a weapon is this. You become afraid of honesty. The moment honesty becomes dangerous, the relationship has already changed, because healthy relationships may contain conflict. They may contain distance. They may contain difficult conversations, but they do not make truth feel unsafe. And perhaps that is the question worth asking yourself. Are they protecting their peace, or are they controlling yours? Because those two things may look identical from the outside, but they feel very different when you are the one living inside them. The response manipulators fear the most. Most people respond to manipulative silence in one of two ways. They chase, or they panic. They send another message, then another. They apologize for things they didn't do. They explain themselves repeatedly. They negotiate with silence as if silence were an argument. But silence was never the argument. Silence was the strategy. And every message you send in panic teaches the other person something important. It teaches them that distance gives them power over you. That lesson is expensive, because once someone discovers a button that works, they tend to keep pressing it. The response manipulators fear most is not anger. It is not confrontation. It is emotional stability, because emotional stability cannot be chased. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be controlled through uncertainty. A manipulator expects movement. They expect anxiety. They expect pursuit. What they do not expect is someone who remains calm enough to observe the pattern instead of reacting to it. This does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean playing games in return. Manipulation rarely becomes healthier when both people participate. It means refusing to let another person's silence decide your emotional state. A message goes unanswered. You notice it, but you do not build stories around it. A conversation becomes distant. You observe it, but you do not immediately assume responsibility for it. You replace imagination with evidence. That changes everything, because evidence asks different questions. Have they communicated their need for space? Has this happened before? Is this a pattern or a moment? Powerful people ask questions before they make conclusions. Anxious people often do the opposite. Remember this. Not every silence deserves your pursuit. Not every absence deserves your explanation. Not every distance deserves your guilt. Sometimes people are simply busy. Sometimes they are overwhelmed. Sometimes they genuinely need time alone. But if silence repeatedly appears whenever accountability appears, pay attention. If silence repeatedly appears whenever boundaries appear, pay attention. If silence repeatedly appears whenever honesty appears, pay attention. Patterns reveal motives that words often hide. And once you see the pattern, the spell begins to break. Because manipulation survives in confusion. Awareness removes confusion. And the moment you stop fearing silence, silence loses much of its power over you. The most dangerous thing about manipulative silence is not what it makes you do. It is what it makes you become. At first, you chase answers. Then you chase reassurance. Then, without realizing it, you begin changing yourself to avoid the silence altogether. You speak less honestly. You hide your frustrations. You stop asking difficult questions. You become smaller, safer, easier to manage, and that is when the manipulation has done its deepest damage. Not because it controlled your behavior, but because it changed your identity. Carl Jung once warned that what remains unconscious directs our lives, and we call it fate. Many people spend years trapped in patterns they cannot name, walking on eggshells, overthinking every conversation, reading emotions that were never spoken aloud, believing they are simply being sensitive, when in reality, they have been trained to fear disconnection. This is why awareness matters. Because once you can name the pattern begins to lose its power. You stop asking, how do I make them stop doing this? And start asking, why am I accepting it? That question changes everything. Because manipulators do not create weakness. They look for it. They look for the fear of abandonment, the fear of rejection, the fear of conflict. Then they build their strategies around those fears. But the moment you become comfortable with losing people who only value your obedience, their leverage disappears. The moment your self-respect becomes more important than their approval, their leverage disappears. The moment silence no longer frightens you, their leverage disappears. Because silence only works when you believe connection at any cost is better than distance with dignity. It isn't. Some people use words to reveal who they are. Others reveal themselves through what they refuse to say. Pay attention to both, because human nature speaks in patterns long before it speaks in sentences. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is that the people who use silence as a weapon often fear the very thing they create in others. Loss, abandonment, powerlessness, control. Sometimes manipulation is not confidence. Sometimes it is fear wearing the mask of confidence. Remember this. Healthy people use communication to solve problems. Manipulative people sometimes use silence to become the problem. Learn the difference. Protect your peace. Protect your boundaries. And most importantly, never become so afraid of losing someone that you lose yourself. This is Coded Soul. Decoding the patterns hidden in plain sight.